Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. In 2003, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage, and the bank signed a contract to give Mike the money to build the house. Mike, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints, and the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told, don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. "Are you serious?" my mother had asked the worker who installed them. "These cabinets won't hold more than a few plates." He just shrugged. "I'm just doing what I was told, ma'am. Talk to Mike about it." The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway, and so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Mike's work. "Listen," my dad said firmly, "this house is nowhere near complete. We can't possibly move in." The representative, Mr. Wallace, became angry, as the bank had paid Mike a lot of money. "You're being unreasonable," he snapped. "Let me see this supposed disaster for myself." He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door, casing included, fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. "What the hell?" Mr. Wallace shouted from beneath the door. The bank called Mike, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Mike wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. "Look, folks," Mike said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "every new build has a few issues. We'll fix the door, but you're making mountains out of molehills here." My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a stay-at-home mom in a nasty rental with 2 tiny children, while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank and Mike treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot. My dad got depressed. "I just want a safe home for our family," my mom would say through tears. "Is that too much to ask?" Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Mike threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," Mike warned my dad over the phone. "I've fulfilled my end of the contract." "You call this fulfilling the contract?" my dad shot back. "The house is a death trap." So my exhausted parents went to an attorney and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tiling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank and Mike would win. The attorney, Greg, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Greg's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. "This doesn't look good," Greg muttered as he flipped through the documents. Then, abruptly, Greg smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents, "tomorrow." So my parents, Greg, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Mike, and Mike's attorney met at the bank. Greg didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else started to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" Mike's attorney chuckled. "This isn't a mobile home," the bank's representative said dismissively. "What are you talking about?" Greg, in a sweeping, theatrical gesture, placed a deed on the table. "My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." Mike's attorney stared at the deed and then turned and stared at Mike. "You built a house on land you don't own?" Mike nodded, his face draining of color. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered, No. "We assumed." The representative began weakly. "You assumed?" the bank's attorney exploded. "We don't assume anything in real estate," Greg said firmly. "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state, at once." My dad said he'll remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week, with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Mike was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. "This can't be happening," Mike muttered, putting his head in his hands. "Could they have gone after my parents?" "Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment. But to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people. It was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank and Mike couldn't do enough for them. "Let's take a step back," the bank's attorney said, suddenly cordial. "I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." "We want to make this right," Mike added quickly. "I personally guarantee all the work will be done correctly." The house was brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Mike. My parents signed the mortgage. Mike got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired, and Greg, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. "Sometimes," Greg told my parents as they celebrated with dinner after everything was settled, "the simplest solutions are the most powerful. They never even thought to check who owned the land." Before you question this tale, please remember that 2003 was over 20 years ago. Banks did things differently back then. Smaller rural banks in particular were not run the same way the bigger city banks were. There were still regulatory loopholes, and in a smaller community people didn't always follow them anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Yes, they built a wall through the bathtub. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunch bag on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the bag, so he left it there and built the rest of the cabinet around it. When my mom discovered it months later, the smell was indescribable. "What is that?" she'd asked my dad as they pried open the cabinet. "Oh God, I think it's been there since construction." I don't know where Mike found these people, but they were gems, every one of them. The next one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get into it with a homeowners association, but here we are. This whole mess started about 6 months after my wife and I bought our house in what seemed like a quiet, suburban neighborhood. The place was perfect for us. Decent schools nearby, a big backyard for our dogs, and most importantly, it was close to my construction business. Now, I should mention that I run a small contracting company. Nothing fancy, just me and a crew of 5 guys doing residential renovations and additions. It's honest work and it pays the bills. Part of running this business means I have a work truck, a full-size pickup with a crew cab and a utility bed in the back. It's not some beat-up junker either. I keep it clean and well-maintained because it represents my business. Sure, it's got my company name and phone number on the doors, but it's tasteful lettering, not some garish billboard on wheels. The HOA in our neighborhood had always been pretty low-key. We got the usual notices about when to put out trash cans and reminders to keep our lawns mowed. I paid my dues on time and never caused any problems. My truck sat in my driveway just like everyone else's vehicles, and for months nobody said a word about it. Then the HOA got a new president. This guy had just retired from some middle management position and apparently decided that running the HOA was going to be his new purpose in life. Within weeks of taking over, people were getting violation notices for the most ridiculous things. Someone got cited because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another neighbor got a warning because their garden gnome was considered visual clutter. It was getting absurd. I should have seen it coming when he started walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking notes and photos. One evening, I came home from a job site to find a violation notice stuck to my front door. According to the HOA president, commercial vehicles were not permitted to be parked in driveways or on the street overnight. I needed to remove my truck immediately or face fines. I read through our HOA bylaws that night, all 73 pages of them. Nowhere did it say anything about commercial vehicles. There was a clause about not parking RVs or boats in driveways, and another about keeping vehicles in working order, but nothing specifically about work trucks. I figured this was just the new president on a power trip, so I wrote a polite email explaining that my truck didn't violate any existing rules. His response came the next day. He claimed that even though it wasn't explicitly written, commercial vehicles fell under the spirit of maintaining neighborhood aesthetics. He said my truck was bringing down property values and that several neighbors had complained. This was news to me since I got along great with everyone on my street. I suspected those complaints didn't actually exist. Over the next few weeks, the notices kept coming. Each one had increasingly ridiculous demands and threatened higher fines. He wanted me to park my truck at a storage facility. When I pointed out that would cost me money and wasn't required by any actual rule, he threatened to call a special meeting to vote on creating such a rule. He started showing up at my house, taking pictures of my truck from the street. My wife was getting uncomfortable with his behavior, and honestly, so was I. The breaking point came when I got a certified letter stating that the HOA board had voted to implement an emergency amendment banning commercial vehicles. The vote had happened at a special meeting that was announced with only 48 hours notice, and it took place at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday when most people were at work. Only 4 people showed up, the president and 3 of his retired buddies who he'd apparently recruited to the board. They voted unanimously to ban commercial vehicles, with enforcement beginning immediately. I had 72 hours to comply or face daily fines of $200. I was furious. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics or property values. This was personal harassment, and it was clearly targeted at me since I was the only person in the neighborhood with a commercial vehicle. I decided it was time to fight back, but I needed to be smart about it. That's when I remembered something my real estate attorney had mentioned during our home closing. There had been some complicated history with the property boundaries in our neighborhood. Our subdivision had been carved out of a larger parcel decades ago, and there were some interesting quirks in how the lots were divided. I called my attorney and asked him to pull all the property records and survey documents for the neighborhood. What he found was absolutely beautiful. When the subdivision was created, the developer had set aside a small parcel at the entrance of the neighborhood for community use. This was where the HOA had eventually built their office. A small building where they held meetings and stored neighborhood equipment. Here's the thing though, that parcel was never actually deeded to the HOA. It remained part of the larger property holdings that got divided up when the developer sold off the subdivision. Through a series of sales and transfers over the years, that specific parcel had ended up included with the lot that eventually became my property. My wife and I didn't just own our house and yard, we owned the quarter-acre lot that the HOA office sat on. It had been an oversight in the paperwork, something that nobody had noticed or cared about because the HOA had been using it for so long. But legally, clearly, and indisputably, I owned the land under their building. I had my attorney verify this information 3 times. We checked surveys, deeds, title insurance, everything. There was no doubt about it. The HOA had been operating on my property without my permission for years. Technically, they were trespassing. Now, I'm not usually a petty person, but this HOA president had pushed me too far. He wanted malicious compliance. I'd give him malicious compliance. He wanted me off the property? Fine, I'd comply with his demands, but I'd also enforce my property rights. I waited until the deadline he'd given me was 1 day away. Then I had my attorney draft a letter to the HOA. In it, I acknowledged their new rule about commercial vehicles and stated that I would be complying immediately by removing my truck from the neighborhood entirely. However, the letter also informed them that I had discovered I was the legal owner of the parcel their office building sat on. As the property owner, I was formally notifying them that they were trespassing and had 30 days to remove their building from my land. The letter included all the survey maps, deed records, and title documentation proving my ownership. It also noted that I had been more than generous in allowing them to use my property without compensation for the time I'd owned it, but given the HOA's recent aggressive stance on property violations, I felt it was important to ensure everyone was following the rules properly. The response was immediate and panicked. The HOA president called my attorney's office a dozen times that first day. My attorney told me he was practically screaming into the phone, alternating between claiming the documents were fake and threatening legal action. But every attorney he consulted told him the same thing. The paperwork was legitimate. I owned that land. An emergency HOA meeting was called for that weekend. This one was well publicized, and nearly every resident showed up because word had spread about what was happening. The HOA president tried to maintain control of the meeting, but people were angry. They'd found out about his harassment campaign against me, and they weren't happy about the underhanded way he'd pushed through the commercial vehicle ban. Several people spoke up about other ridiculous violations they'd received, but the real issue was the building. The HOA had no legal right to be there. Moving the building would cost tens of thousands of dollars, money the HOA didn't have, and there was no other suitable location in the neighborhood for it. Some people suggested just using someone's garage for meetings, but all the equipment and records were stored in that building. I sat quietly in the back of the meeting, just watching it all unfold. Finally, someone asked me directly what it would take for me to let them stay. I stood up and said I was willing to work something out, but first, the commercial vehicle ban needed to be repealed. The president tried to argue, but he was shouted down by his own neighbors. The vote to repeal was unanimous, minus his single opposing vote. Then I laid out my terms. I would lease the land to the HOA for $1 per year for the next 20 years. In exchange, I wanted a written agreement that I would never receive another frivolous violation notice, and that any future rule changes would require a properly noticed meeting with a quorum of at least 30% of homeowners. I also wanted the HOA president to resign immediately. He refused to resign at first, but the other board members were already discussing his removal. Turns out that several of his emergency amendments had violated their own bylaws about proper notification and voting procedures. By the end of that meeting, he'd been voted out and replaced with someone who actually wanted to work cooperatively with residents rather than rule over them like a petty dictator. The new board accepted my lease terms gratefully. My attorney drew up the paperwork, and it was signed within a week. I got to keep my truck in my driveway, the HOA got to keep their building, and the neighborhood got leadership that actually served the community instead of power-tripping residents. The former president moved out of the neighborhood a few months later. I heard through the grapevine that he couldn't handle the embarrassment of what happened. My truck still sits in my driveway every night, and every time I see that HOA building at the neighborhood entrance, I smile a little. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone abusing their power is to show them they never had as much power as they thought they did in the first place. I complied with his demand to address property issues in the neighborhood. I just addressed my own property rights first. The next one is a petty revenge story. I have to make a left turn at an intersection where the line to make that turn backs up at least half-mile every workday. It's about a 15-minute wait when it's bad, and about 10 minutes in normal traffic. A lot of people skip that line and cut off drivers who wait patiently to turn. It gets hazardous when those same idiots literally force their way into the turn lane, regardless of another vehicle already existing in that space. Early last week, some dipcrap literally just shouldered my car out of the way. They saw me. They heard my horn. They kept merging. I avoided that accident and carried along with my day, although I was incredibly irritated. 3 days later, some dipcrap tries the same thing on the truck behind me. A woman in a mid-sized sedan decided that she was getting in the left turn lane come hell or high water. Unfortunately for her, the lane she was merging into was already occupied by a full-size pickup. She probably would have realized that if she had looked where she was going, but she didn't. She hit the truck, of course. It damaged her car, of course. Nothing major, just knocked her mirror off. I watched the whole thing because that truck was directly behind me. Her head never turned. She was looking straight ahead as she collided with that truck. Something about her body language and the fact that she pulled her phone out to record the truck after the accident she caused told me she was a Karen. I just knew she was going to lie her ass off to avoid fault. Now, my tiny bit of petty revenge. I gave the truck driver my cell number, told him I saw it all, and offered to share my observations with the cops or insurance company. This was not the same car that almost hit me earlier in the week, but it was the same entitled bullcrap attitude. The truck driver's insurance called me the next day, and I told them exactly what I saw. It was enough information to exonerate the truck driver and put fault on the dipcrap in the sedan. I don't know what happened after that call, and I really don't care. I got my petty revenge against one of those dipcrap drivers. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 2 months ago, I worked for an absolute tyrant of an administrator. Dude was terrible. Terrible enough to warrant me writing in the apparent point of view of a 48-year-old teacher wishing he was Sigma. But I digress. Before working for this school, I was teaching 8th grade math, 4th grade math, or being an academic coach for the previous 18 or so years. I switched school primarily due to location. I found a school on the other side of the mountain I stare at nightly and figured it was a good match. Nope. This admin, we'll call him Poppin' Fresh, shut me down every step of the way. I entered the school middle of the school year with very rough kids, and my first day training the academic coach for the school and district trained us up on this math/ELA/anything-you-want gaming program called GimKit. I understand that GimKit isn't education in and of itself. It's simply a 5-minute tool to find out if kids know the content, and it engages the kids greatly. My first day with students, I saw their terrible behaviors. They ran 2 other teachers out of there, evidently, so I decided it was going to take a little bit of grace to get them to listen to me. I showed them GimKit. They had popped open their Chromebooks for no more than 30 seconds when TA, terrible admin Poppin' Fresh, came in and shut it down instantly. He never assesses the situation. He just sees kids on hokey-looking activities as he literally pops in the classroom, bouncing around like he's on something. Anyway, this happened all the time. I would instruct for no more than 8 minutes tops, and walk around and help them with concepts the best I could. I would be walking around, he would pop in and tell me to change something, like clockwork. Every program or strategy or center-based activity I try to use to get the 7th graders motivated gets shut down instantly, and he finally says out loud, "Teach only what's on the tests, nothing more." Bet. I took this as an opportunity to enter some MC with a side of, I can't believe I'm here. I start going by the book 100%. Anytime a student asks, why do we do it like this? When we are working on surface area and volume, I only say, that's not on the test. Anytime I, naturally, find an urge to find a connection to other standards, I stop myself. It's not on the test. Over a short amount of time, students are frustrated and sitting there yawning. It pains me greatly, so I decide to only apply my MC when good old Poppin' Fresh pops his way back into my classroom. He finally pops in with his boss's boss, and a couple of people I've never seen before. I instantly switch from my going deeper, thinking outside the box, activity-based learning to exactly what he wants, teaching only what's on the test. I instantly turn into Ben Stein from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and the kids instantly groan, saying, "Mr. OP, I hate when you teach us like this." Comments from the students fly about the room. "This is the worst part of my day. I hate math now, thanks," and many much more colorful, expletive-laden commentary. Frank Caliendo even popped in for a spell. Now here's a guy who doesn't know how to motivate students. Boom! Poppin' Fresh even doubled down on his usual banter, putting on a show for his crew of bosses. "These kids seem highly unmotivated, OP. We need to meet about this if you can't get them engaged." I interjected, "You said to only teach what's on the test, so that's what I'm doing. Only. What's on the test, right? Like if they wanted to know why this happens or that happens or how to solve this a different way, that's not on the test, right? You told me just to be up and be teaching and never have them on their Chromebooks, right?" I said this to him, in definite earshot of his accompanying party, mainly because I had a feeling these were the head honchos, the ones who signed off on spending all that money to make our school a true one-to-one school, a school where every student has a Chromebook. Not utilizing the Chromebooks is something I knew that was something Poppin' Fresh believed in, but I had a feeling that the district would want the kids properly utilizing them. He answered back to me, "I only stopped you from using the Chromebooks because the kids were all just playing games." The students interject then, "It's a math game." The head honcho moved to Interjection City. "Well, let's see what this math game is all about." I had the kids get their Chromebooks. They all excitedly logged on. I pulled up a surface area and volume GIM kit, and the kids were feverishly playing the game, using pencils and notebooks to solve the problems needed to be answered to gain ammunition in their game. It was active. It was fun for all. I paused the game when needed to show different ways to isolate the variable when solving surface area problems, especially of spheres and cones, etc. It was what education was supposed to be. Poppin' Fresh ran out of pop, and by the end of the day I received an email from the head honcho himself asking me about him and how things were going. I was honest with him. I told him about his assaults, threats of assaults, and hiding assaults. All things that I'm sure would be an interesting part of this tale, but they aren't related to the MC inherent here. It's also an ongoing investigation, even 2 months later as I'm teaching at a new school on the other side of the proverbial mountain. Poppin' Fresh is under investigation for what he's been doing to me and other new teachers to the school, and it's crawling all the way up the chain. The next one is an entitled people story. I live in a first-floor apartment directly above the parking lot. One of my neighbors regularly pulls into her spot, parks, and just sits there with the radio blaring or on speakerphone having full-volume conversations. It's so loud I can make out what the person on the other end is saying from inside. This happens often enough that I know the sound immediately. Last night around 10 p.m. I was trying to listen to a podcast and make dinner. I heard the noise and was already frustrated and hungry, so I stepped outside and sternly said, "Can you please turn down the radio? I can hear it from inside my apartment." I tried to say this in my most stern, calm voice, trying to be clear that I was not angry, just annoyed. That was apparently enough to set her off. She immediately got out of the car, looking absolutely livid that I had the audacity to say something. Before I could even process it, she started yelling at me, accusing me of being disrespectful and starting something. Then it got surreal. Out of nowhere, she claimed I had hypothetically thunked her forehead, which made zero sense. I was on a balcony above her. She kept ranting over me, and when I tried to explain I wasn't trying to start a fight, she interrupted me with, "You're a racist," just flat out accused me. I was stunned. I hadn't said anything remotely racial. I was just asking her to turn down her music. Trying to clarify, I said, "I know where you park. Your car's the one I hear all the time." Meaning this isn't a one-time thing, and I wasn't confusing her with someone else. She took that as a threat and snapped back, "Well, I know where you live." At that point, I realized this was escalating fast and getting out of hand. I said, "Let's go to the front office and talk to management. Handle this like adults." She agreed, but kept shouting at me the entire walk down the hall, calling me a racist repeatedly, loud enough for anyone in their apartment to hear. When we reached the front desk, I explained we were having a slight disagreement. While I was talking, she shoved past me and started banging on the office manager's door, even though it was technically closed for the night. The manager came out, confused. At this point, I knew things were going to get interesting. I was calm the entire time, and she was in hysterics. I grabbed a chair to appear less confrontational, and I just let her go off. The neighbor immediately launched into another tirade, escalating again, saying how I threatened her and am a racist for even saying anything. She said I was inside getting drunk with my friends and that her having a conversation with her mother caused me to get aggressive with her. At one point, she looked me dead in the face and called me slow. That really stung because I have dyslexia and it's something I've dealt with my whole life. I kept calm, but it was like no matter what I said, she was just looking for things to throw at me. I was starting to get very frustrated because the manager wasn't letting me get a word in. I was getting shouted down by crazy while they stood by. The manager finally separated us and asked me to wait in the office. When she came back to speak with me privately, I apologized for the way things escalated and said I should have just come to the office in the first place instead of confronting my neighbor directly. I told her I don't want conflict. I just want to be able to enjoy peace and quiet in my home. She asked if I'd be willing to try apologizing one more time to the neighbor, and I said sure, even though I knew it probably wouldn't help. At this point, I figured I had to be the bigger person just to end the confrontation. As expected, when I stepped back outside to say my apology, I barely got a sentence out before she started yelling again. She said she might call the cops because she feels unsafe. I stayed calm and said, "If you feel the need, go ahead. I live in apartment 126. I added, "Let's just pretend we don't exist to each other." She didn't look at me and said I sounded like a crazy person to the manager. That's where it ended for now. But we are neighbors, and she parks under my balcony. I now feel uncomfortable in my own home. I genuinely don't want issues with any of my neighbors, but this woman seems unhinged, and something tells me this won't be the last time I hear from her. Wondering if I handled this correctly, what I should do now, etc. Anyway, thank you for watching.